Welcome to the Enterprise Excellence Podcast, where our purpose is to help create a better future. Learn from our world's experts how to improve your organisation sustainably. Learn how to achieve and sustain an excellence journey for yourself, others, and the planet.
And I'm your host, Brad Jevons, coming to you from Brisbane, Australia. We are proudly brought to you in association with SA Partners, a world-leading business transformation consultancy. SA Partners are a truly purposeful company focused on helping organisations achieve sustainable improvement for themselves, others, and the planet. Welcome to episode 31 of the Enterprise Excellence Podcast. I'm so pleased to have Mr. Lewis Trigger on the show with me today. Lewis is a constraint innovation expert, a specialist in helping organisations and people realise vast untapped resources and capability. Lewis studied with Dr. Eli Goldratt, the founder of the Theory of Constraints, and has taken these learnings to new levels. Lewis has dedicated his career to helping others unlock potential and create a better future. Let's get into the episode. Lewis, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Brad. I'm very, very happy to be here from the other side of the globe, right, here in Israel. But yes, I'm definitely happy. In fact, you've given me a great time. It's now, 11:30 in the morning. A bit late for you, but for me, it's good.
Yeah, Brisbane connecting to Israel. It's an amazing new world. Lewis, question, what's your backstory? What significant moment in your early life shaped who you are and who you've become?
Okay, so I'll give a little bit on myself. I'm just on the personal note right here because we've already alluded to the fact that I'm not sitting in Brisbane. I'm on the other side of the globe. And the question probably some of the listeners are probably asking, what is this chap who grew up in Brisbane doing there over in the Middle East, so to speak, particularly in Israel? So I'll just say that, number one, as you probably could figure out, I'm an Australian Jew. And but I've also have an Israeli citizenship and been living here. And I was very much, on one hand, I was brought up very, very much with an Australian tradition. My grandfather's actual veteran from an original veteran from Gallipoli. My father and all my uncles fought in the Second World War, and very much grown up. If you want to say the Anzac tradition of basically helping your mates, solidarity. Doing the right thing. These are values that I very much was brought up in Australia. But I also have a very, very strong Jewish heritage as well that I was brought up with. So I suppose what made a big influence for me is basically being in both of these worlds, the Jewish tradition and Jewish heritage plus my Australian tradition. I had an unusual experience in life where at the tender age of 17, after finishing high school at Brisbane Grammar, I was sent over to Israel on a special program from the Jewish Agency, which sends young boys and girls from the Jewish communities over to Israel to be involved in basically a lot of youth work in terms of the community and in being involved in the life in Israel, with the idea of being able to bring back, if you want to say, a lot of the messages that come out of Israel back to Jewish communities in wherever they've come back from. The particular year I went was 1973, which for some that might ring a bell, because 1973 was when, unfortunately, we had the October War, the Yom Kippur War, which we talk about over here in Israel. And when the war broke out, of course, as a very young man, and then I just turned 18, you never think anything can actually happen to you. That's probably why they always send young people off to war, because they never think something's going to happen to them. And I found myself in this unusual situation where, with a bunch of other Australian Jewish kids, we were in this army agricultural settlement down in the Sinai. And throughout the war, and that whole year was an incredible experience in itself, which obviously connected me very much to Israel. But the October War in itself had a particular strong influence on me. Again, I was very lucky that nothing happened. And again, you never think anything's going to happen. But there are lots of experiences that came out of that, which are probably, if you want to say, that whole year, which with the culmination being the October War, created with me as a young man a very strong desire to connect my life later with Israel itself. So I went back to Australia, did the right thing, very much involved in the the Jewish community, plus also the Australian community, and did arts law. But the moment I could get out of Australia after doing my undergraduate studies, I came over to Israel. And I suppose that's been a big thing in my life. And by the way, it just turned out by coming to Israel, that actually, as the paths moved ahead, which was connected me, if you want to say, to what I call constrained innovation, or the theory of constraints, which we'll get on to more. But had I not come to Israel, I probably wouldn't have had the same sort of exposure and involvement with TOC, which was later on as things moved on. But connection with Israel has obviously had a big, big influence on my life.
Yeah, wow. And how wouldn't it? That month or so you spent in the Sinai there during that war, that must have been mind-blowing coming out of Brisbane into that.
It literally, I mean, I have to admit, I won't go into all the details of what happened, and fortunately, I never got hurt, and neither my friends. But it did have a huge influence. Number one, it showed to me unfortunately, just how vulnerable Israel is, and that we live in a very, very rough neighborhood. And again, I'm a great proponent of peace. And again, there's been some tremendous movements in the last couple of months, probably which you've seen in the international news, with Israel now having peace agreements with the Emirates. Finally, I can fly through Dubai with no problems, even the fact that I'm coming from Israel. And in fact, just interesting on that episode, Brad, I'm very much hoping, I'm just now starting to open up some commercial connections with Dubai in terms of doing some constraint innovation training with them. So that again is one of the lovely things that's come out of the, if you want to say, the movement for peace in the Middle East. We need a lot of it. But again, it's an area, it's a part of the world where I think in Australia, it's difficult for people to understand it, of what goes on in a lot of parts of the world where life is not so peaceful, where simply, by just simply being a good neighbor, you expect the other side to be good neighbors. It doesn't always work out like that. You have to be very, very vigilant. So it's a part of the world where I think most Israelis like me share a great desire for peace. But on the other hand, you have to be very, very vigilant in our area and not to be naive in terms of being able to achieve peace in our region itself.
Yeah, I could see, and that's where that agreement is such a big outcome, I guess, when you get an agreement.
It's tremendous. I think that'll help us where there's already been tremendous cultural exchanges between the Emirates and Israel, and there seems to be a genuine desire also from that population, from the Arab population within the Emirates states, to have a very good relationship with the Israeli people, not just with the state of Israel. And that's what we're aiming for more and more over here in the Middle East. I mean, when it comes all down to it, Brad, as you know, people are people, and that's it. We all, really comes down, we all have the same desires in life. We want to be secure economically. We want to be secure just in terms of our lifestyles. We want to have families. We want to have love in our life. We want to have good relationships. I mean, these are just universal things that people want to have. It's just unfortunately it gets mucked up because of a lot of ideology and fanatics, unfortunately, that can muck things up along the way. But yeah.
Yeah, too true. And Lewis, with that background you've had and ending up in Israel, like where did your journey into constraint innovation and improving organizations start? Where did that connect in for you?
So good. So I wanted to get into that. So where it really came from was from my experience in the Israeli Air Force. I was an officer with the Israeli Air Force for over 16 years. And when I first went into the Air Force, I joined the Air Force in 1984. And in fact, that was just, if you want to say, when TOC had only come out in the world with the publication of the book, The Goal, from Eli Goldratt. But at that stage, I really wasn't that familiar at that stage with TOC in 84. The Israeli Air Force, because of my background, I'd already done an MBA and in Israel, so they were using me as a process improvement expert as an officer throughout all these various processes in the Israeli Air Force, maintenance on the weapon systems, supply chains, and development of weapon systems themselves. So I was already very much in the area of process improvement. And in 1989, Israel was very interesting. It was the first time in Israel there was an outcry from the population in Israel in 1989, where they were demanding, the population was demanding that more money should be spent from the public service, or basically from public money to be sent in terms of public services for the population, in terms of health, education, etc. You're probably not aware of that, but close to, very much close to 50% of Israel's GNP gets spent one way or another on defense. It's an amazing number. I mean, it's a number which is staggering, that people can't quite understand. And even though we do get a certain amount of assistance from our allies, the Americans, the bulk basically of that, if you want to say, of the weight of defense falls on the Israeli population. So the population was turning around and saying, look, we want more being spent on us. And so typically what happened is when does the Israeli government or any government react when there's going to be elections? And so this was just before the elections. So they turned around and they went to the Ministry of Commerce and the Treasury, if you like to say, the equivalent of the Treasury, says, well, where are we spending all our money? Well, it's not very difficult to understand. It's obviously on defense. And they said, let's do a Pareto of where money gets spent. Well, when you look at the defense budget, close to 50% of the defense budget gets spent on, guess who? The Air Force. And so they turned around through the Ministry of Defense of the Air Force and said, look, you guys, we're going to make cuts. We can't carry on like this. But of course, the defense needs don't go down. So the Israeli Air Force, the top of the Israeli Air Force, had these huge cuts. And in the beginning, their initial response was, okay, we have all these cuts, but we have to keep up our defense. So everyone has to work harder. Well, there's only so much, how much more energy can work into harder. You go to an engineer in the HQ of the Israeli Air Force and say, I want you to think harder. So how much can you do in order to improve your productivity by just simply working harder? They realize that doesn't work. So whenever the Israeli Air Force basically has any problem, they always look to their, if you want to say, their big brother, which is the United States Air Force. The United States Air Force said, hey, interestingly enough, these were years of Reagan, we're actually going through the same problem. Well, we brought in this consultant, which we're surprised you haven't heard of, called Eli Goldratt. And Eli Goldratt is one of our main consultants using TOC to answer that fundamental question of how can we do a lot more of the right stuff with what we have? In fact, how can you do a lot more of the right stuff with less? And the head of the Israeli Air Force said, really? Okay, that's interesting. Well, we haven't actually heard too much of Goldratt, which is, typical. You never hear the old saying, you never hear the prophet from your own town. And so the Israeli Air Force did a little bit of more research on this, and they earmarked me, which I was very fortunate to go off to do another degree, my Master of Science, over to the American Air Force, in which I was then mentored by Goldratt. Through my studies. So I was very, very fortunate to be taken, if you want to say, under his wing when I went over there. And that's when I got fully exposed to really, if you want to say, TOC. And that's when the journey really started. From then, it was going back to the Air Force and implementations and all the rest. But that's really where it started. And it was just an amazing experience, mentored by Goldratt, and then by some of my lecturers, professors from the American Air Force, the Air Force Institute of Technology, one of the best tertiary institutions around the world, who were also coached in TOC, and they obviously coached me as well.
Isn't it a small world? Like
Absolutely. When I first met Goldratt in America, it was very interesting. I was introduced to Goldratt, and we all had to be in our full, and our military uniforms. And I had my Israeli Air Force uniform on. The Star of David, of course, was planted on there. And he looked at me. He was surprised because he didn't know that he was going to be meeting me. And I was introduced to him. And then he said, and many times he would say this he said, Lewis, I was so surprised. Here I am, coming from Israel, trying to teach TOC to the Israelis for years. They never wanted to listen to me. And then here I've got the representative from the Israeli Air Force in America with the American Air Force, and yet he's got this very strong Australian accent. So he said, it's such a strange combination of factors that get together. Yes, and so that's how we started off. That was basically the first, if you want to say, interaction with Goldratt. But he was an amazing man. And as you probably know, unfortunately, he passed away 8 years ago. But he really left us an amazing legacy with the theory of constraints. And again, it's not just out of commercial reasons. I very much believe in the theory of constraints as being one of those mindsets and tools in management that can help so many organizations, basically any type of organization, if you like.
Yeah, definitely. And I got to admit, the goal was one of my favorite reads, and theory of constraints is one of my favorite aspects of continuous improvement of all. It truly was amazing. Lewis, what inspired you to keep working in this field? Like it's a tough field, looking to bring in improvement, and I'm sure it was a tough job within the Israeli Air Force too. This is never a smooth ride. What's inspired you to keep working in the field?
Well, probably just because of my own character. I ended up living in Israel and living in Australia, obviously where I feel that I'm very much attracted to areas that I feel that can make a definite difference. And also, but I think that what attracted me so much to this, you can see if you're able to do a successful implementation, which again, there's a big if, and a lot of conditions have to be in place, but we're able to do that. You can actually you're able to make a real change within organizations, but even more than that. TOC, as you would have seen, when you read the book, The Goal, Goldratt deliberately used 3 stories to be able to impart the knowledge of TOC. One story, of course, was the factory. The classical case. But you remember, there are 2 other stories there, Brad. There was the story also here of the Boy Scouts with Herbie. And then, of course, there was the story also of the marriage, or if you want to say the family unit. And the message he wanted to impart there was it doesn't matter what type of system you're dealing with, providing it is a viable system, providing it's a system that's alive. That, this type of mindset of TOC, where you focus on where your constraint is and you leverage it, it makes a tremendous change, and also makes sense of what seems to be very often impossible situations, makes sense of so much havoc. And it really isn't that difficult. I mean, it's not rocket science. So I suppose that so much attracted to me was on one hand, it has this tremendous impact. On the other hand, is really when you get into the nitty gritty of it, is the simplicity of the idea in itself. And I guess the third factor is that people, I come across people that have gone through, which I've done facilitated training, I'm involved in implementations, etc. And very often they come back to me and they say to me, Lewis, it wasn't just something which had a great impact on our company. It's something which I use in my life. It's something which helps me in terms of the way I manage basically many systems in my life. And I think that also is tremendously satisfying. Mind you, I've tried to give a few lectures to my children. With my children, I have to show it to them personally without actually lecturing it to them. so that's what it comes down to.
Yeah, too yes. True. I think we all in continuous improvement anyway go through that. And Lewis, what was some of the people that, like, you've inspired so many people throughout the journey with the work that you've done, but who are some people that inspired you along the way also?
Okay, so I've obviously made mention of Goldratt, of Eli Goldratt. And again, I don't want to exaggerate and say that we were the best of friends. I mean, he was the guru, if you want to say. And I like to think of myself over the years, I've become a little bit of a little guru, but he's definitely the big guru. And I would keep contact with Goldratt from time to time, and that was good. But I suppose I have to say that in terms of specifically the TOC, which is, again, I use the term constraint innovation, which maybe later I'll get on to why I call it constraint innovation, which is a variant, if you want to say, of TOC. But probably the other person, even more than Goldratt, who made an influence on me, was a chap by the name of Colonel Moore. Colonel Moore is a colonel from he's now a retired colonel from the United States Air Force. And he, as I said, he was the one of the main points of contact for the United States Air Force in rolling out TOC and through so many areas of the United States Air Force. And he was also one of the professors at the AFIT, the Air Force Institute of Technology. And I was straight away, if you want to say, linked to, it was already decided that I was going to be mentored by Colonel Moore. The way it's set up with the American Air Force, with their tertiary education, is when you go into their programs, you always have one of the professors there linked with them. In addition to your courses, they are your mentor as you go through. And so he really, if you want to say, even more than Goldratt, he mentored me with TOC. In fact, he was my thesis advisor that I did. And the whole thesis, by the way, was a whole application for one of our big maintenance depots for the Israeli Air Force, which later on, after writing the thesis, I actually had to put it into place when I returned to the Israeli Air Force, which is a story in itself. But he was a tremendous influence on me. Probably the other person who was a great influence, if you want to talk about professionally in that area, was also another professor there from the same place called Reynolds, Professor Reynolds, who interestingly enough was the guru on statistics. But again, he was very much a man. He'd also understood TOC. He wasn't the TOC expert like Moore, but he understood TOC and he understood what process improvement was. And he was tremendous, if you want to say, also a mentor, but also instilled with me so much of this desire to also to be able to improve. And again, he would come with the statistical tool of looking at life, and that also would have made a big influence on me as well.
Yeah, that'd be amazing being mentored by someone with the statistic capability they had back then. Like I look at some of the work of Deming and people like that with statistics. It's just amazing what they did.
Absolutely, yeah. Lewis, and I have to say, just getting on statistics for a moment, I'll tell you right now, I'd gone through statistics courses before that. I hated statistics when I did it before, Reynolds. I mean, when I remember that when I did my MBA program, I hated it. And what it shows is it's not the material. It depends on who teaches it. It's as simple as that. That's what it comes down to.
Too true. Lewis, do you mind sharing some background on constraint innovation? So where you've taken theory of constraints and added more and created constraint innovation. I'd really like to know some more.
So one of the main underlying principles of TOC is that it can show very logically, and it's very logically organized, that if you take any system that's viable, it's always got a goal that's going to be infinite. And it can be proven over and over again that the goal is not a target. A goal is going to be infinite. You know, in simple terms, in the commercial world, it's obviously it's a stable, ongoing profit, if you want to say, which is basically an infinite goal in itself. If you talk about even, I've very often been involved, if you want to say, in terms of family businesses, particularly when I go to the area of agriculture in Australia, which are family businesses, where making money isn't the goal whatsoever. Making money, if you want to say, has to be put in place as a condition. It's a condition, but it's not the goal. The goal there, what they want is really to make sure that business is handed on to their children and grandchildren, etc., which means that they have to constantly improve in a world of competition. If I deal with, for example, I deal with the health service, public hospitals, both here in Israel and also in Australia, it's obviously to provide the best possible health to the community. So you're always going about a goal that's infinite, which pure logic, there has to be a constraint. In many cases, it's the market. Very often it can come into an internal constraint, which is probably going to be, in most cases, going to be your best resources, because your best resources are like a magnet. They get more and more placed on them, particularly at peak time. So they become the constraint. And the underlying principle is, once you realize this, and once you're able to actually identify the constraint, which in most cases isn't all that difficult, you then, it'll lead you to where your, if you want to say, your critical resources are, which often end up being your bottlenecks, if you like to say. And then you leverage them. You turn them literally into an asset. You take your best resource, which is now your constraint, which is your bottleneck. And you don't simply say, okay, let's snap my fingers and get another one. The very fact that your best resource, and they end up being a bottleneck, is because you can't get another one. It's not easy to get another one. And so you have to know, okay, what do you do with that? And what TOC offers through its methodology is the way of going through these steps, very logical steps, with very practical tools of being able to leverage it and turning it as an asset, to get that much more out of it before adding more capacity, which is the more difficult thing. Now, where I, if you want to say, have gone out slightly out of the fold of TOC is because over the years, I've been introduced to so many other very good management doctrines like Lean, like, offsprings from that, like Agile and Scrum, areas of concurrent engineering, very good tools and if you're going to say methodology of risk management. I can go on with quite a list of good management doctrines which are out there. What I've always found is how do you get the most use out of these management doctrines? And what I've always gone back to, it's always never failed me, is that I always use TOC as an umbrella. I've always used that as an overlying document, and then I can fit in where I can see the absolute advantage of other really good methodologies like Lean. So many good areas of Lean, but I like to focus Lean particularly on the area of the constraint, using a lot of the ideas with the constraint itself. Where you're using techniques of Kaizen for that, or even the idea like 5S in Lean. I find, when you combine it with TOC, I find it has a brilliant, again, it's not that I did the synthesis, but I didn't come up with 5S and I didn't come up with the TOC, but just take, for example, something like 5S, which I imagine most of the listeners are aware of. What people aren't aware of very often, that one of the reasons why the Japanese introduced the idea of 5S, and where I embrace it with TOC, if you like, it's really to make sure that your workers or employees don't put in more work than what's needed for the constraint, but at the same time to keep them busy. So you keep them busy by doing 5S, which has got a lot of good attributes in itself, but you don't introduce any new assignments in your workplace. And that's the reason why 5S has been put in there, because, as you know, with 5S, even with the Japanese system, the moment you get your Kanban and tells you have to produce something or supply something, you're not going to muck around with your 5S. You're going to stop doing your 5S. But on the other hand, once you don't have to do something to feed your constraint, and typically in the Lean system, it's the market constraint, then you want them at the same time to do something useful, and at the same time to keep them calm. They're not going to be fired because you don't want them actually producing anything. So get involved with 5S. So this is just an example, if you want to say, of how you're combining a lot of good other methodologies. And then altogether, I package all of that, if you want to say, as something like called constraint innovation. And it's an ongoing, it's not something, it's a journey which doesn't finish, just like with you, Brad. You'd come across all the time, you come across really good ideas and you say, okay, how can I now incorporate that in what I'm doing?
Well, it's very impressive, but Lewis, I can see you've got to know the goal and then bring it back to understand where the constraints are and why they're the constraints and where the value of that constraint is. And then from there, you can choose the right approaches to actually innovate.
Absolutely. And unlock. Absolutely. This is like, and this is where often I find that, you're going to say the jaw drops when you're dealing with your audience, and when you're dealing with people implementations, that things that, which are really common sense, they're just really good common sense. But the moment I put in that structure of how you're leveraging constraints, wow, look how much more we're able to get out of the system without adding anything, by using those principles.
Yeah, it's amazing. Lewis, do you have an example of where you've seen it done well? Is there anything you can share in that regard?
I'll give you lots of examples, but again, I don't want to fill up the whole interview just with that. Look, I deliberately thought about this and decided I'll give you a couple of examples of various industries, because I think that really that shows you, on one hand, TOC or constraint innovation, if you want to say, on one hand is generic, but on the other hand, you can build a solution like, if you like a glove for your hand. So let's start off with my first major implementation where I felt that there was like a real, a measurable and proven improvement. And that was when I went back to the Air Force. And I'll just relate to the story that, my thick thesis was on how do you implement TOC within the Air Force. And I took one of our big armaments depots, a huge armaments depot, which does maintenance overhauls on these weapon systems within the Israeli Air Force, and showed how you could be using it, and primarily using it there, particularly in the whole scheduling rules of drum buffer rope and dealing with it there. And how I got involved with that, of course, is when, because I was paid for by the Israeli Air Force to go to the American Air Force. My officers wanted to know what I was doing. When I finished it, I sent them a copy of my thesis. Of course, none of them read my thesis, but they did. A few of them actually read my abstract. And when I came back, they said, "Hey, Lewis, do you think this actually works?" And I said, "Of course it works. I've proven it statistically." Remember my good mentor, Professor Reynolds, who had given me all the statistical tools. I've proven statistically that this works. And they said, "Oh, really? Okay, so you prove it to us, and we're now going to put you into the position." They said, "You're now a major, and we're going to put you in charge of if you want to say, the whole scheduling and production of our big maintenance depot. Let's see what you're worth." So that was when I got thrown into the deep end. It was my first major implementation in it, and it was amazing. And I'll just give you the end result. The end result was by having identified where our main constraints were within that armaments depot, and then basically synchronizing everything around that main constraint in itself. Before agents around it, we had an improvement where prior to that, we would be given a monthly, if you want to say, demand from headquarters. They would aggregate the demand of all these bits and pieces of weapon systems that we had to do an overhaul and have them come out. And we had a monthly, if you want to say, a monthly plan that had to be implemented on doing it. The statistics were that up until we did this implementation, the norm was that we were able to succeed about anywhere between 50 to 60% of it. Of course, there was 101 reasons why we would explain why we couldn't do it, right? But this was the way, not just for our armaments depots. In fact, in the Israeli Air Force, there's a number of major Israeli armaments depots. They all had the same number. It didn't change. And it wasn't because people were slacking off. People worked hard. That's what we could get to. When we did the implementation with a number of, it was within 2 or 3 months, we were getting up in the vicinity already of above 95% of being able to fulfill the demands. We didn't change the demands. The demands were put in there. And there were no allowances made for us. We couldn't decide what we wanted to work on. It was decided for us. So we couldn't fiddle around with it. Let's go on the easy ones, right? This was it. And we were able to have this huge gap of being able to achieve our schedule, basically our plan. 95% were on target of what we had to do. And there was no additional resources put in there whatsoever. It was an amazing turnaround, which, by the way, you have to understand that the meaning for that, this is not a commercial. This is where we're talking about the defense of the state of Israel. And by able to have that improvement, we're able to improve significantly our combat readiness in a significant way just from having that leap. Again, by the way, the moment this came through, and obviously, it was well known within the Air Force, we then adopted that exact same model for all the other armaments depots, and the same thing happened. We had this huge jump. So probably that was my first major implementation, and that's where I had to do the work. It wasn't me training other people to do the work. After that, I can tell you probably just a couple of other examples of implementations where, again, typically I come as the facilitator. The people who come up with the solutions are the people within the organization. I'm a great believer of that. That in the end, as you come in as if you want to say the expert on the area, you're a facilitator. You facilitate the improvement. And so an example I just here is that 2 years ago, I think it was 1.5 years or 2 years ago, the big hospital, the Lyle McEwen Hospital in Adelaide. It's one of the big public hospitals in Adelaide. They brought me in to see how we can improve what they call the patient journey. This is how they call it, a patient journey as you go through the hospital. Quite interesting. Obviously, your work in process are the patients that are going through. They're literally your work in process that you go through, and they get processes you go through. Again, amazing. To me, again, it was tremendously satisfying because, number one, you're dealing with a tremendously good cause. This project, by the way, was sponsored and set up by the University of South Australia. They've got a great executive training program, and they'd been working with the hospital and doing lean implementations before that. But again, when we did this particular implementation and we had a whole cross-section of senior people from different departments in that hospital, and that's what you need to have. You need to have, because, as the patient journey goes through, he just doesn't go to one place. He actually does have a journey through the hospital. And you need to have that collaboration of the various departments as they go through. Again, I don't want to get too much into the actual statistics of it. On the Israeli Air Force I spoke, but here there was, in terms of the way you'd be measuring the success here, a big part of the success here, again, just like in a manufacturing plant, is you want to reduce the lead time, if you want to say, of the actual orders that go through. So you want to reduce the lead time. For the moment someone turns up at the hospital until they actually leave the hospital, a healthier person, then you want to reduce that lead time. Number one, what that does is it reduces, it basically, one, it says, frees up resources in the hospital to be able to do other work. So if you want to say in terms of cost efficiency, it's fantastic. Number two, it improves the health of the patient, him or herself, because as you know, one of the most unhealthy places to be in is a hospital. So you don't want to be there for too long, because you're going to catch something else. So that had a tremendous improvement for them as well, in terms of the actual health that's going through that. But again, this was, when you look at the lead time, of course, it had to be looked and measured at the same time, that it's not on the expense, if you want to say, of the quality of what was actually going through there. So that was also being very much measured in terms, in fact, the quality goes up, as I said, because there was less time, plus the fact that it was so much more, if you want to say, so better collaboration between the different departments that we're doing. And again, I didn't come up, that's the thing which I love the most. Often when I'm involved in the implementation, my jaw drops, not because I come up with it, they come up with it. I give them, I tell them my war story, so to speak. I show them the tools, and then we say, okay, let's start showing how we implement it as we go through. And again, that was also, we want to say, the second thing. And probably I'll just give you one more, is I'll go into the resource industry, because I get involved quite a lot with the mining companies in Australia. So I'll give again really nice. I mean, there's several I've been dealt with. A nice one is at Cadia with Newcrest Mining. Again, a number of years ago, Newcrest Mining, Cadia, the biggest gold mine in Australia, the third biggest in the world. And again, they had what seemed to be an impossible problem. They'd got to the stage where they had literally an internal constraint, a huge internal constraint, which they didn't think they could do anymore. It was called the crusher. They had this huge underground mine, and this crusher comes down and takes these huge boulders and turns them to tiny little pebbles that then goes through this whole process where it gets liquefied and you take the gold out of it. Anyway, they'd done everything they possibly could do to get more out of the crusher. They'd already identified, they didn't need me to say, where is the Herbie? The Herbie was clear. It was staring them in the face, this huge crusher. But again, it was amazing. Then I sat with these people, and again, it was an implementation which went on for a while, of how they could squeeze that much more out. And you don't come up and say, buy me another crusher. That isn't the solution that's going to be given to do that. And that wasn't the solution we could do. And by just, if you say just a % increase of throughput for this gold mine, it actually turns out, in terms of, talking basically millions of dollars that come out in terms of throughput. So again, I don't want to go on. These are like 3 different implementations, if you want to say, that have been measured and shown the success. And again, I deliberately wanted to show you different worlds when I did them, totally different environments when you're doing them.
Yeah, it's an amazing outcome that can be applied anywhere when it comes down to talking from hospitals to Air Force to mining to anything. Lewis, like, absolutely, you and I know what can be achieved with theory of constraints, and the examples you gave were amazing. But what have you seen through your career that stops organizations achieving what you do? Because I know in our world of continuous improvement, it's often a big challenge.
Absolutely. And it's a really good question, Brad, because it raises an even bigger question. Not just in terms of what I've been doing, but raises a question about TOC in itself. And in fact, I'm involved obviously in TOC organizations globally, and we struggle with this question. Goldratt, by the way, until his dying breath, if you want to say, struggled with this question. Was, look, if this is such a logical body of knowledge, it has such huge implementations and huge ramifications in terms of improvements. So why hasn't it been readily adopted by everyone? Because quite frankly, if I've got to be really honest about it, when you look at what goes on in terms of good management doctrines around the world, TOC still is very much on the sidelines in terms of being widely practiced. And that really is a question in itself, why that is. And it's not because it's outdated. I mean, it came out in 1984, it's still going on. But look, lean came about, if you want to say, with Toyota production systems in 65. And it's healthy and going and doing very, very well, right? So it's not, something that's good doesn't become outdated. And so It's not a question of that, of not being. So really, people have struggled with this. Why? And by the way, interesting, when you explain, when you do implementation, people say, hey, pity I didn't hear about this 20 years ago. I mean, but why? What stops it from going? What I'd say is that the struggle with TOC, if you want to say, I actually looked at this a little bit more and actually wrote a paper on it. Daniel, I'm just looking at my own notes here. Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize recipient, wrote an excellent book about Think Fast and Slow, a really good book, which has also become a bestseller. And he notes here, he talks about the difference between fast thinking and slow thinking. And that, if you want to say that, when you think in logical terms, he calls that part of your slow thinking, very logical terms. And TOC is very, very logical. The fast thinking, on the other hand, it's really based, if you want to say, on your notion of what reality is, which, if you want to say, comes down to intuition. And I'm not trying to knock intuition, but you've got to remember, people's intuition is really based on their limited experiences they've had in life and their belief systems, for good or for bad. And what often happens is you'll find that what is perfectly logical in terms of your slow thinking doesn't get accepted because it's at odds, if you want to say, with the emotional fast thinking, which comes down to your life experiences or your so-called intuition, your belief system. And where TOC, I think, has, if you want to say, the Achilles heel, I have this paper which I've written called the Achilles heel of TOC, where TOC relies on logical thinking. It relies on slow thinking, if you want to say. And the traditional form of management, traditional management techniques are very much wrapped up with the idea of what we call the efficiency syndrome, being efficient. There is this underlying belief, it's a belief, that everyone does their very best within the organization, then you're going to get a good result. Well, TOC challenges that and says it's not true. In fact, the only, if you want to say, resource, if you want to say, that has to do its very best is your constraint, or your critical resources. In fact, all the other ones, all your other resources. And as you know, they all interact with one another. They don't work in isolation. In any organization, all your various departments and resources, and however you divide it up, no one works in isolation. They all are interconnected with one another. All the others, they actually have to be what we call, they have to be effective, not efficient. Effective means doing, if you want to say, doing those actions which are going to assist the organization getting closer to its goal. Remember, we talked about the goal earlier on. Efficiency, on the other hand, talks about doing something, if you want to say, in the right way, but not necessarily doing the right thing. And so by everyone doing their very, very best, not only does it necessarily help, it actually very often, if you're not the constraint, it actually can hurt the system because it hurts the constraint. Because, just to give you an example, people aren't always going to be available for the constraint because they're so busy doing the right thing, being tremendously efficient. And again, the book The Goal even illustrates that in a number of stories about showing that. But what we've just shown right now here, and again, TOC does in a very logical way, that you actually have to build into the improvement program, and it's ongoing, a certain level, not just a certain level of inefficiency actually has to be built in order to be able to make sure that you're always going to be available for the constraint, number one. Number two, what we talked about before when I told you the story about the 5S with lean, that you don't introduce work there that shouldn't be there. And introducing work that shouldn't be there comes from an efficiency syndrome of constantly making sure that you're working, and we're going to measure you to make sure you're working. That, by the way, was my biggest challenge in the Israeli Air Force. Of course, our traditional measurements were based on basically utilization of every single resource. And that was a real challenge, to be able to change that mindset, that no, we don't want that. And I think that that's really what really holds back TOC, between the slow thinking and the quick thinking. So how do you get, that's basically the challenge. The question is how you get across that. But that really, I want to say, the obstacle of traditional management thinking of efficiency syndrome at a local level. The local optimum doesn't create, if you want to say, a global optimum, and actually has the exact reverse effect. It actually creates the situation, the organization to be hurt by having local optimum.
I really hear what you're saying, Lewis, because the ultimate goal of an organization, there is an ultimate goal of the organization, but they need to get the value through the organization to reach that goal. And ultimately, it's how do we as a team get it through the organization in the most efficient method, not work as individual silos, to be the most efficient as individual silos. Is that?
I would slightly correct effective. Most effective way.
Definitely.
But true. Okay. I don't want to be harsh on you. Okay.
That's great. I understand it. It's so logical, but when you think about it, but it requires, like you said, that slow thinking and that more system thinking to actually achieve it, rather than thinking as fast and individual type silo thought, or like you'd say, most proactive outcome by every individual, every machine in the whole organization.
Right. So yeah, so there is more I could add on on how you overcome that. But yeah, I'll let you're conducting the interview, Brad.
Well, Lewis, what are some things that organizations can do to overcome this? Like, what advice would you give?
So I've again, if you want to say, a lot of my answer actually interesting. It's based on, I try to use slow thinking when I think about that, but again, I have to say it is based on my life experiences, which is almost a contradiction of what I said earlier on of your belief system. But what's come down where I've tried to look at, okay, let's see, when the implementations have really gone well, why has that been? And when the implementations, just my own experiences, implementations didn't seem, it wasn't like, sure, people were happy with, if you want to say, the workshop, but when I come back and look what's done to the organization, I haven't really seen a big change within the organization. Why is that? And I think what it comes down to is that to be able to overcome that, where I've been able to see that it's been successful, it's again where it's interesting. I use a lot of the TOC slow thinking to be able to come up with a solution. And where I say, how can we actually turn the constraint now into an asset? Where the constraint being here, what's holding us back, if you like to say, is the quick thinking. That's what's holding us back, that emotional side. So what I see within organizations, most organizations I come through, where people will respond within the organization, throughout the organization, to, if you want to say, leadership within the organization, senior leadership. Now, notice I make a distinction between senior leadership and senior management. They aren't necessarily the same thing. I make a tremendous difference because, again, one of my experiences that I've had in the Air Force more than anything is I have tremendous respect and I have tremendous respect to who my commanders were within the Air Force. What they showed me through example was not management. They showed me what is leadership. Huge difference. Now, with leadership, if you are able to then show the leadership, the logical thinking of TOC, of basically saying, okay, we have to have a change of mindset from being efficient at local levels to being effective at all levels, by the way, also at a local level, but it'll have that effective result for the organization. And with the senior leadership, and by the way, anyone you talk to, it doesn't have to be senior leadership, anyone who you explain that to, they'll understand it, they get it. The problem is how do you get it then implemented in the organization? The people who have to drive the implementation in the end is the senior leadership. Now, how are they going to do that? Number one, obviously, they have to have that logical commitment a logical understanding and a commitment to the idea. That isn't the problem. But then you've got to get them to drive the rest. Now, again, people are driven emotionally. And this is where the difference is between management and leadership, because when the leadership is driving it, not the management, when people recognize you, when the employees within your organization, the members of your organization throughout, from all the levels, they have this respect for the leadership. They have this belief in the leadership. And the leadership now is saying, look, this is the way we think we should be doing our business based on these principles of being effective. Then it starts to work. But you need to have one other thing to basically close it. And that is your performance measurements. You know, there's this axiom in management which says, tell me how you measure me, and that's how I'm going to behave. It's absolutely true. The moment people are being measured and they realize there are repercussions from their measurement, for good or for bad, right? They respond. Now, typically what happens, this is the unfortunate thing, is traditional management uses utilization of every resource as being a major measurement, which obviously when people are being measured by that, they're also going to behave that way. And that's what creates so much problem. But if we put in a set of performance measurements, which by the way, again, TOC has been very good at being able to develop, which is able to actually connect your local action at a local action to its result on the whole system. And it's all got to do with how you're impacting the constraint in the end. And the leadership is driving it. Then it has that effect. So this is really where I find it's critical. I'll just finish that part. The reason why I was able to, if you want to say, be what they call successful within the Air Force is I had a very good break, if you want to say. What happened to me is that the Israeli Air Force is not too top heavy in terms of rank. There's only one general, and there's a limited number of brigadier generals, and then it starts to go down. So there's this brigadier general, a chap by the name of Alon Dumanis, who's now retired. And Alon Dumanis, when I was studying with Goldratt, I was able to get, and again, I was only a major. This is this guy, that stage he was and then became a brigadier general. I was able to get him when I was studying to read the book, The Goal. And he was fascinated by it. And then when I came back to Israel, he also passed him from me, but not only just from me. He then connected himself personally to Goldratt. And Goldratt, who'd been frustrated for years on not being able to make a real footprint in Israel, he'd had this huge success everywhere except Israel, which really, if you want to say as an Israeli, really sort of got to him. And finally got this brigadier general from the Israeli Air Force who's really interested. So that to me was fantastic, because now I had senior leadership who was supporting everything that I was doing and basically pulling it out. In other words, you couldn't go in the end, when you went into the boardroom of this brigadier general, Alon Dumanis, when he was all into this thing, and you went in and you were a full colonel and you went into them and you had to make some sort of improvement. If you didn't talk in terms of the terminology of TOC, if it wasn't within that mindset of what we're talking about, he would just basically tell you to get out and come back and work on it again, right? And that I think showed me a lot. And again, I think that also is really, if you want to say, the key to being able to have that success, because otherwise what you're going to have is you're going to have very limited isolated success. You're going to have an area where, for example, I've done this where I've had it where I say I felt frustrated. I come into an apartment, I work on one, that's all I'm allowed to work with. I mean, I've only been given, if you want to say, a mandate to work just with this one department. So no one else is involved. The senior leadership isn't involved whatsoever. I've just got this one department. Oh, they're all gung-ho. They're fantastic. They meet a brick wall in the end, particularly when it comes to performance measurements. Because even though they're convinced that traditional performance measurements isn't right, that's what they're being told by the finance guys, that's how they're going to be measured, by utilization of every resource. But no, we've been shown it's totally different. They said, forget about that. This is what you got to do. Tell me how I'm going to measure you, and that's how you're going to behave. So again, this is where it becomes frustration. But on the other hand, it does show the light of how you can actually break through.
Yeah, measures drive behavior, don't they? I've seen it so often.
Absolutely.
Before.
Absolutely.
And Lewis, what I really like about our conversation on constraint innovation is the amount of focus it brings to an organization also. When you think about, and you would see it How busy do you see leaders being when you initially meet them in an organization? Like, how flat out are they? How stressed are they? How
Well, that's
It's massive. And when you think about the theory
absolutely.
of constraints, it sort of focuses in your energy on improvement quite rapidly, doesn't it? And it can take away a lot of the noise very quickly.
Absolutely. This is the thing that people often think, oh, that poor old bugger called Herbie, right? He's going to be, he's going to be flat out. The opposite's the case. What it does is exactly right. If when I go, like a doctor, you go into an organization, you have to basically feel its pulse and take its heartbeat, check, its sugar levels. There's a very simple check that I do that I go into organizations. When I go into organizations, I simply look around. I don't ask too many questions and say, how much bad multitasking is going on in the organization? For at all levels, from the top level right down to everyone. Everyone is mad, jumping from one assignment to the other, not finishing the assignment they're working on right now, wasting time to get back into the assignment when they have to go back to it again. And it feels like, eventually, of course, it's not like everyone's going bankrupt. It's not like, for example, people are dying in hospitals left, right, and center. I mean, obviously, the throughput gets through, but at what expense? And the amount of havoc and the amount of energy that is expended on this and the frustration that comes out of it is tremendous. And we're actually able to get, that was the brilliant thing when I give that example of the maintenance step of the Israeli Air Force. I mean, when we had 55% of meeting our schedule, we were working flat out. We're all over the bloody place, and that was the amazing thing, because the Israeli, when I showed the idea to the senior leadership, the commanders in the Israeli Air Force, they said, Lewis, it all looks good, but show us that it works, because we don't think it can work, right? Because we're already doing the very most we can. We can't work any harder, right? And I said, it's not going to work any harder. That was the amazing thing. When we put it into place, the whole atmosphere within that armaments depot changed. Everything was a lot more calm. We're actually focused where we knew where we had to focus. We knew where we had to have the important decisions that were being made, and where basically you could back off and say, it'll take care of itself. Don't worry about it, right? So these people haven't finished that particular assignment. Don't worry about it. They've got ample capacity. They'll catch up regardless of what they have to do. What they have to make sure is we take care of the assignments which are needed right now for the constraint, because they're the one of our constraints. There are very few, by the way, that you actually have to focus on. Absolutely right, Brad. And that's the amazing thing it does. It creates, in terms of, one of the side benefits, if you want to say, for TOC, it creates for people a happier environment from all levels. That's really what it does. And that's, businesses aren't in business to make the environment happier, but that's certainly a nice side benefit.
Yeah, it is. It's amazing. It's basically, in a way, you're taking the Pareto principle that can be used on so many aspects, but you're applying it to systems and really getting your right focus there. It's amazing. Lewis, what advice would you give to someone just starting out in their journey? So someone in leadership or someone in business improvement just starting out, what advice would you give them?
I think you have to get into the trenches. You got to dirty your hands. I don't advise, people, often students will come up to me, and I also lecture in the academic world in Israel, and students will come up to me in industrial engineering courses or business administration, says, Lewis, what do you recommend? Would you like, by the way, an assistant in your consultancy business? And I said, I'll be doing the worst thing to bring you in as an assistant. You need to dirty your hands. Join an organization. Join if you want to say, an established organization that's running with traditional processes. You'd like to be an organization where they're open to new ideas. I'm not saying not to do that, but first of all, dirty your hands. Get involved. Whatever is the area of improvement you want to get involved in, whether you're going to be in IT or whether you're going to be basically getting into the operations side, the traditional operations side on the shop floor. Where's the actual area, if you're going to be involved more in quality issues of that company? First of all, dirty your hands. Get in there. Go through it. Go basically, walk. You have to walk the rope, quite frankly. And you have to go through it. You have to have experienced it to go through it. Only then, one of two ways. You're going to go in one of two ways. If that's the profession you enjoy, you're involved in improvements. You're either going to continue within that organization and then go up and make more and more of an impact and become senior person within that organization as life goes on. Or you can go and a decision like you and I've made, where at one stage or another, we decided, hey, we want to be off and be on our own business and basically to be giving over training and implementations, but not to do it straight away. I think that, it doesn't matter how brilliant you are. I think that, and people sense it, by the way. People, when you come in as someone who comes to assist us, an outsider, people can feel whether you've got grease under your fingernails or not. They know that you've gone through it. You know what you're talking about. You've experienced those frustrations, and you can add that type of insight, which a student, however brilliant he is, he can't internalize it. What it means to really do an implementation simply by reading about it in a textbook. It doesn't work like that.
No, too true, Lewis, too true. And Lewis, final question I've always got for guests, I'm keen to hear from you, is what have you learned recently about your area of expertise that you didn't know before? What's been a recent insight for you?
That's interesting. Yeah, I thought about this question, by the way, Brad, and I want to bring it back to what we're experiencing now with Corona, COVID-19, right? A worldwide challenge that we're feeling. It's not the problem of Israel or Australia or the United States. Number one, I've seen two things I want to quickly say on this. I see where I've seen, and I've been looking at different countries, in particular in Israel, where I see things have gone well. I said to myself, hey, this is a classic TOC implementation. Even if they didn't know they were doing TOC, I could just see it. I could talk about that for a lot. I'm not going to because of limited time, but where it works well, I say, hey, these guys intuitively use TOC. It's amazing. And by the way, where I see it hasn't worked well, I can see exactly reasons why they didn't. That's number one. The other thing I learned for me, which is something new, I've always used as a mantra, if you want to say, when teaching, constraints are our best assets. Constraints is our best asset that we leverage to get that much close to our goal. What the COVID-19 has taught me is that there are exceptions where the actual constraint can be something very negative. Because I look at right now, what is the world suffering from right now? What is our constraint, if you want to say, both health-wise, in terms of economy, also in terms of your mental health as well, in terms of your social being, right? If you want to say the one big constraint, if you want to say that's going on in the world, there's lots of other things going on as well, but it's obviously the constraint, which stops us from our goal of if you want to say, what's our goal of life? And that's an interesting question itself, but in a nutshell, it's self-realization of where we want to be. That's really what our goal is, which is, by the way, infinite self-realization. What's really one of the big things holding us back is COVID-19. And so to me, that was an eye-opener where I can actually see there are the exceptions where the constraint can be negative. However, having said that, where does it fit into everything? Sure, because from that constraint, what it'll still do, it'll lead you to the solution. Because what it does is that you realize that it will lead you through the logic primarily to what are the critical resources that are positive, that are overload, that are your true bottlenecks that you have to leverage. And I'll just quickly on COVID say that on a worldwide level, and also sometimes also for countries, obviously we've got to the stage now, particularly in Israel, where the critical resource is the vaccine. We use Pfizer over here. We're happy with it. Right? So that's it. That's it. And the question is then, how do you leverage it? And it's interesting how they leverage it in Israel. And again, there's lots of stories of how we don't waste the vaccine, how we're getting the most out of the vaccine, how we're able to prioritize what are the assignments the vaccine's being used for. In other words, it gives you, again, we get straight into the TOC from that. But then if you go down to the level, for example, of hospitals, where unfortunately Australia is very fortunate, but a lot of countries in the world like America, Italy, in Israel right now, we've now had an upsurge of people being infected and becoming critically ill. And we haven't got the stage where the health service is actually crumbling, is going under, but it's getting close to there. So again, it brings you to the critical resources. and they're basically your corona departments. We've got special departments that deal just with corona. That's your critical resource, and they have to be leveraged to get the most out of it. So again, I suppose that's the thing where I had that insight of, again, even if where the constraint is negative in such a terrible way, in the end, you turn it around, and from that, it'll allow you to get to find where the solution is going to be. It'll lead you to the solution in the end.
Yeah, to those other constraints that you can deal with and actually, leverage and create efficiency or capability through in a time when you've got this negative.
Well, that's the thing. That's the thing. I say, for example, I say the vaccine isn't a constraint. The vaccine is the critical resource that has come from the constraint, as opposed to the situation like the big crusher at Newcrest. The big crusher at Newcrest was the constraint. That was the constraint. It's as simple as that. That was what was holding them back. They didn't have a market constraint. In fact, they had more demand than the crusher could give, and was the most loaded resource. So that, I think, was the big insight that I had about that, in terms of where constraints can be negative, but they will lead you to the critical resource that you then leverage using the TOC.
Yeah, too true. Well, Lewis, thank you so much for the knowledge you've shared, and thank you for everything you continue to do and will do more of into the future to help us create a better future. Lewis, we really appreciate it, mate. Thank you.
Brad, it's my pleasure. It's a pleasure, number one, to reconnect with you, which from many years ago that you've heard some of my war stories. And it's a pleasure also on a very personal level to reconnect to Brisbane, my my home city that I grew up to, and I've got so much affection to it. I very much hope it won't take too long. They'll be back on my flights to Australia. That's what I'm waiting for.
Yeah,
to get up and visiting again and working in Australia again. Absolutely.
Yeah. It's
Thank you very much, Brad, for having me.
No, Lewis, really appreciate it. Brisbane has produced many great people, and thank you, Lewis, for all you do. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye. There were 3 key takeaways for me from this episode. Firstly, clearly understand your organisation's goal. Does your organisation know it? Does everyone in your organisation understand it and have a relatable plan and goal aligned to it themselves? Secondly, take the time to think slowly and understand your constraint. Lewis had a great point relating to getting your hands dirty, going and seeing the operation where the work is done. Once an organisation clearly understands its constraint, it can run improvement and overcome it to keep moving towards its goal. This focus within an organisation will bring clarity and focus in a world that often lacks it. With focus, improvement becomes much more straightforward. The third key takeaway for me is considering how you are measuring and rewarding people within your organisation. Is it aligned to your organisation's goal, and does it help or hinder your current constraint? Measures, recognition and reward drive behaviour. Suppose these systems are not aligned to your organisation's goal and supporting your constraint. In that case, you will have an organisation working against itself rather than aligning in a cohesive way towards your goal. Thanks, Lewis, for your positivity, your amazing practical stories and your passionate nature. It was an absolute pleasure to speak with you, and we will look forward to connecting again in the future, hopefully back in Brisbane. Bye for now.